President Trump and Chairman Kim arrived in Hanoi, Vietnam for their second summit earlier to warm receptions and red carpets. But it's hard to think the president isn't the slightest bit distracted by what's happening back at home with his former fixer on Capitol Hill today. The New York Times notes of the Kim and Cohen split screen, quote, the clashing narratives follow what has become a frustrating pattern for Mr. Trump, in which some of his biggest moments on the international stage have been overtaken by events at home. Foreign trips mark critical moments for every president, but for a president in search of evidence to support his claims that he has strengthened the United States' position in the world, they have not always been the successes he had hoped to portray, which means the stakes for this summit are even higher, as NBC News reports, quote, for a president facing both turmoil at home and pressure abroad born of his failure to extract concessions at the last Kim summit, or at least the appearance of failure, may not be an option. Everybody is back. These are always high stakes undertakings for a president, but they're usually done, well, actually, to be totally honest, they're usually pre-cooked. There's usually no suspense. You walk into a bilat, a communique has been worked out with your cabinet. This president's cabinet has been leaking to the media, and we're grateful for it, that they're really nervous about what's going to happen, and they're squeezed out. The summit will be Trump and Kim and their translators. What could go wrong?
Right. Well, yeah, a lot. And exactly, the stakes are so high this time around, and you can't flatter your way into a nuclear peace deal with North Korea. And I think what we've seen so far in leaks and in just the way President Trump handles himself is that he loves to deal with strong men by flattering them and so touting his friendship with them and sort of going into a room and feeling things out. He even said previously that him and Kim Jong-un fell in love. He's changed his rhetoric, not calling him Rocket Man. That's not going to get anything done. And there is really no one in government who is convinced that either China or North Korea are going to concede or do these sort of sweeping things that President Trump is going to say that he wants them to do.
No, they're not going to do it. But, you know, I've been sort of on the other side of this all along because I think it's fine. If he's going to meet with Kim, rather than have them snarl at each other, you know, little rocket man, you know, the great Satan, that sort of thing.
My button's bigger than your button?
Yeah, exactly. I would rather have them, you know, go to Singapore, go to Vietnam, have a meeting, hug it out, you know, and it's not going to accomplish what the president says it's going to accomplish, even though he will claim it has. It's not going to convince Kim to give up his nuclear weapons, because he's not going to do that. I agree with the intelligence community. He's not going to do that. It's not going to take concrete steps that could potentially make it seem safer to live with the existing North Korean threat. We're not going to negotiate limits on the missiles or whatever that are.
So why
that are
I'm missing your thread? Why have the meeting then?
Why have the meeting? Because if they weren't having the meeting, they would be, you know, whose button is bigger, and I think that's a more dangerous situation. So this is a holding action.
Well, why are they having
that will wait for actual diplomacy.
Why they're having the meeting is they're two reality stars using each other. I mean, Kim Jong basically, he bowled a 300 at age 4. The first time he bowled, he was driving a car at 4. He, you know, he's created this mythology, as has Trump. And what Trump is doing, and it's actually more dangerous. You know, your president, you know, kind of his big mistake was saying there were weapons of mass destruction where they weren't. It's actually more dangerous to say they're not when they are, because it's a real threat, which is kind of ironic. But to Gene's point, of course he's never going to give up the missiles. I mean, he could call Gaddafi. I guess I can't call Gaddafi about that. And he owns a country. He owns a country. He is not ever committing Harry Carey to. It's just not happening. They're going to sit there. He's not giving them up. If I was his advisor, I would tell him, do not give them up. And Trump basically gets theater, kabuki theater. It's very simple, and just comes away and goes, you know, look, things are better. We're buddies, and that's it. It's a reality show on both sides.
Aaron Blake, let me bring you into this. To me, as a former staffer, it also reveals the limits of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo's power. They can only do so much, and I think in their mind, they probably have Pence down doing the real diplomacy, trying to get rid of what they view a bad and dangerous leader in Venezuela. And the fact, though, that this is how low the bar, that this is viewed, and it sounds like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and Eugene have come to the same conclusion. Like, who cares? Let him sit in a room. Let him play ping pong. Who the bleep cares? No harm, no foul. That they've come to that conclusion is such a staggering public-facing piece of evidence that they don't know what to do with the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, and I think that only goes so far, though. It works right now while these are negotiations, while it doesn't look like the North Koreans are ready to actually give in. It works up until the president decides that he wants to make a deal. What happens when the president thinks that what Kim Jong-un has told him is good enough? What happens when he starts talking about how he wants to relax sanctions, which is, by the way, something that Mike Pompeo has talked about in recent days and really relaxed the language a little bit. Before it was no sanctions relief unless they totally denuclearize and we can prove it. Now it's, well, there could be some sanctions that are taken off the table. If you look at exactly how the rhetoric has changed on this, it's looking more and more like they might view this as a situation in which they have to do something maybe incremental to sate the president and his desire to come up with some kind of a deal and maybe win a Nobel Peace Prize at some point. So we'll have to see what comes out of this. But I think that when you talk about Pence, when you talk about Bolton, when you talk about Pompeo, their role in this is mostly to prevent a bad deal. And at this point, they're going to do whatever they can to make that, to prevent that from happening.
Let me just follow up with you, Aaron Blake. I mean, we also, I think everybody here is old enough to remember when the American president stood up and stood against human rights abuses. This is a leader who he keeps calling great and brave and on the cusp of creating, you know, North Korea's version of Boca on his beaches, who murdered his brother, who murdered, I mean, he's not just a dictator, he's not just an autocrat. He is one of the most murderous leaders of a starved, desperate, poor, brutalized, terrorized population. And I mean, American presidents used to not sit down with people like that. They used to not go to summits where they both got the same red carpet rolled out. They used to not bring the American press corps to pay homage to leaders, murderers like that. Where are we?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think this is really a really undersold part of this whole negotiation. This is not just about denuclearization and how that's going to come to pass. This is not just about relaxing sanctions. This is something that is going to have to deal with the human rights record. And if you look at what happened after the meeting in Singapore several months back, the president was asked how much the two of them had talked about human rights in that meeting. And he said that they only talked about it briefly. I don't know how you can cut this deal without in some way addressing the human rights abuses that take place in North Korea, because I think in even just setting aside the fact that you don't want them to do these things, those things are impediments to their economic progress. The president signed a law in 2017 that discourages people from doing business with North Korea because of those human rights issues. So he can talk all he wants about how North Korea is this kind of rising economic star that's really going to take off once they agree to this deal, but actually making that the case and actually creating some stability in North Korea that allows Kim Jong-un the latitude to sign on to a deal like this is something that's going to require real talk about human rights.
There's one problem with that. There's no empathy. We have kids in cages in our own country, so he's going to worry about human rights in other countries?
So all the thought control, the forced labor camps, the famines, everything that he's done, that was basically taken off the table in Singapore when Kim Jong-un was effectively brought into the community of world leaders by Donald Trump. When the American president met with him on an equal level, he legitimized him in a very important way. And so now other world leaders have you know, Putin wants to meet with him. He's had a couple of meetings with Xi, very public meetings as opposed to the way they used to do it. So he has kind of gotten what he wanted out of this deal.
What a legacy. What a legacy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.